All right, so let's jump into India's economic performance in 2024. It's been a pretty wild ride. And, anyone aiming for the UPSC mains exam, well, this is going to be key for you guys.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It's been a year full of surprises. Started with a wave of optimism, really. Remember those stock market highs? And that impressive 7.7% GDP growth in the first half of 2023-24. Everyone had such high hopes.
Yeah, it felt like India was unstoppable, like the sky was the limit. The finance ministry was projecting growth above 6.5% for the whole year, and they were even expecting that the RBI would
Mhm.
start to lower interest rates pretty soon. They were anticipating inflation to stay pretty low too, around 4% through the second quarter of 2024.
Yeah, and that's where things get interesting. So while India did end up exceeding expectations, with a remarkable 8.2% growth for the full year, the second half actually saw a slowdown.
So it wasn't the smooth upward trajectory everyone was predicting. What happened? What factors contributed to this unexpected turn of events?
Well, the elections definitely played a role. That increased government spending leading up to the elections really stimulated the economy. And then the political continuity after the elections helped to maintain that momentum. Then the post-election budget kind of doubled down on this approach, focusing heavily on employment and consumption.
Oh, so the government was really actively trying to fuel growth. Did this focus on employment and consumption? Involve any specific schemes or initiatives that, our listeners should be aware of?
Oh, absolutely. The budget introduced a whole bunch of schemes that aimed at boosting job creation, especially in rural areas. And it also increased spending on infrastructure projects. The whole idea was to increase people's incomes, encourage spending,
Right.
which would then further stimulate economic growth. These are definitely the kind of detail that those UPSC examiners, they love to see you understand.
This is great information for our listeners who are prepping for those UPSC exams. Not only is it important to understand the overall economic trends, but also knowing those specific policies and programs that are driving them.
Exactly. But it's also super important to understand that this growth wasn't without its hiccups. So early data for 2024-25 showed growth dipping to 6.7%, which was a five-quarter low. The extended election period seems to have impacted capital spending, and high interest rates started to affect urban demand, particularly in sectors like housing and automobiles.
So we've got this impressive overall growth, but there are also some potential warning signs of a slowdown emerging. And then there's the whole issue of inflation, right? How did that factor into the economic picture?
Well, inflation's the other side of this whole economic balancing act, and it definitely added another layer of complexity. For most of the year, it stayed below 6%, which fueled expectations that the RBI would cut interest rates to further stimulate growth and investment, something the government was advocating very strongly for.
Yeah, that makes sense. Lower interest rates generally make it cheaper for businesses to borrow and invest, and they can also encourage consumer spending. So it seems like a pretty logical step to try to boost a slowing economy.
You're right. But remember, the RBI's primary mandate is to control inflation and maintain price stability. They were hesitant to cut rates too quickly, fearing it could lead to a resurgence of inflation down the line.
So did the RBI's caution prove to be justified? Did inflation become a bigger problem than initially anticipated?
Well, in September, inflation did spike, driven largely by a sudden increase in food prices. And this really kind of threw a wrench in the government's plans for a rate cut. And it brought this whole debate between growth and inflation control right to the forefront.
I bet this clash of perspectives between the government and the RBI must have been fascinating to watch play out. Could you unpack their respective stances for us a bit further? I imagine this is something that could easily come up on the UPSC exams.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a classic economic dilemma. And
Yeah.
understanding both sides is really crucial. Top government officials were very vocal about their desire for an RBI rate cut, arguing that the focus should be on stimulating growth and attracting investment, even if it meant accepting some volatility in food prices.
So the government was essentially downplaying the risks of inflation. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, they emphasized that despite the recent spike, inflation had remained relatively contained for most of the year. They also argued that a rate cut would be particularly beneficial, given the signs of an economic slowdown, especially with the recent budget's emphasis on job creation and infrastructure projects. They needed lower interest rates to help those initiatives gain some traction.
But the RBI wasn't convinced. What were their main concerns about cutting rates?
Well, the RBI, as the guardian of price stability, was much more cautious. They acknowledged the government's desire for growth, but stressed the importance of taking a long-term view. They were worried that cutting rates prematurely could lead to more persistent inflation down the line, which would ultimately hurt the economy more than a temporary slowdown.
So it's interesting how the government was prioritizing that immediate growth, while the RBI was focused on the potential long-term consequences of inflation.
Yeah.
What were some of the specific risks the RBI was concerned about?
Well, they were worried that cutting rates could erode people's purchasing power, especially if wages don't keep pace with rising prices. They also pointed out that high inflation could make India a less attractive destination for foreign investment, which the country really relies on to fuel its growth.
Right. It's about finding that sweet spot
Yeah.
where you can encourage growth without triggering runaway inflation.
Yeah.
Sounds like a pretty difficult balancing act.
It is, and the situation is made even more complex by the fact that the global economic landscape is also in flux. Uncertainties in the global market, like fluctuating commodity prices, or shifts in global trade patterns. Those things can significantly impact India's economic performance, and it adds another layer of complexity for policymakers.
This global dimension is definitely something that UPSC aspirants shouldn't overlook. How would you suggest they factor this into their analysis of India's economic challenges?
It's all about connecting the dots. You need to understand how global trends, like changes in oil prices, or the policies of major economies like the US and China, can create these ripple effects that impact India. For example, a global recession could dampen demand for Indian exports, which would further slow down growth.
So it's not just about internal factors, like the RBI's monetary policy or the government's budget. Aspirants also need to consider the external environment and how those forces interact with the domestic economy. Sounds like a pretty comprehensive analysis is required.
Exactly. It's about demonstrating that you understand the complexities and interconnectedness of the global economy. And remember, this debate between growth and inflation control, it's an ongoing one. There's no clear-cut answer. And understanding both sides of the argument is crucial for the UPSC exams.
That's a great point. Aspirants need to be able to articulate the arguments for and against a rate cut, explain the RBI's concerns, and analyze the potential risks and benefits of each approach.
Precisely. It's not about taking sides. It's about showcasing your analytical skills and demonstrating a deep understanding of the factors at play.
And don't forget the human element. It's easy to get lost in the numbers and the technical jargon, but these economic decisions have real-world consequences for people's lives.
Absolutely. Think about how inflation impacts, the average person, their ability to afford basic necessities, or how job creation can revitalize entire communities. These are the stories behind the economic data, and understanding them is so important for anyone aiming to do well on those UPSC exams.
It's about connecting those economic concepts, to real-world scenarios and showing that you can think critically. But the implications, that's what'll make your answers stand out.
Exactly. So to recap for all our UPSC aspirants out there, what are the key takeaways from India's economic performance in 2024? Well, first, you really need to understand those factors, driving both the growth and the slowdown. We've got the elections, the budget's focus on employment and consumption, the impact of those high interest rates, and those ever-present global economic uncertainties.
It's like piecing together this big, complex puzzle, understanding how each of these elements it interacts and influences the overall picture.
Yeah, exactly. And second, you need to be able to explain clearly those differing viewpoints on how to manage this growth inflation dilemma. What are the arguments for and against a rate cut? What are the potential risks and benefits of each approach? Why is the RBI taking a more cautious stance?
It's not just about knowing the facts and figures, but also showing that you can analyze the situation from multiple perspectives.
Yeah.
And present a well-rounded argument.
Right. And finally, don't forget to connect these economic issues to their real-world implications. How would different policy choices affect people's lives? What are the long-term consequences for businesses and the overall economy?
That's what makes economics so fascinating and so relevant. It's not just this abstract theoretical subject. It's about people and the choices that they make and the impact of those choices on society.
Absolutely. For our UPSC aspirants out there, grasping these nuances is what will set you apart. It's about showing those examiners that you're not just memorizing information, but you can think, critically analyze complex situations, and articulate your insights clearly and effectively.
So as you continue on your UPSC journey, keep this economic balancing act in mind. It's such a dynamic and evolving situation, and it will likely continue to be a hot topic. But being able to understand its complexities will serve you well not only in your exams, but also in your future endeavors, whatever path you may choose.
And who knows? Maybe one day you'll be the one making these critical economic decisions, navigating this complex landscape for India.
Now that's an inspiring thought. And until then, we'll be here to support you on your journey, diving deep into the topics that matter most. Don't forget to subscribe and like the deep dive. And be sure to share it with your fellow UPSC aspirants. We'll see you in our next episode.